Okay, right. Well, I've framed this as a discussion on China and the world in 2021 with an update focus on the Belt and Road Initiative. As you well know, it's been a very turbulent time and continues to be very challenging in the global system with the COVID-19 pandemic, still raising many challenging questions for the global economy, global politics, international relations, and indeed security and socio-cultural affairs. So I'm sure we'll touch on lots of these things, perhaps in the Q&A as well. So moving on, thank you for doing that, George. I just thought we'd just have a very quick touchdown. I'm sure that many of you who have joined this session already know or already interested in this subject, but I just thought I would give a few moments to reprise what we probably know quite well. The Belt and Road Initiative, also known as One Belt, One Road. If you wanted a technically way of trying to define what this is, really it was launched by President Xi back in 2013, and it has driven forward to become a global project with a $1 trillion global budget. Now, whether in fact that actually eventuates, I'm sure we can have a discussion about that. In October 2017, the political importance, not just a symbolic gesture, but something that would be deeply embedded in the politics and in the personal trajectory of the leadership of President Xi, as he sought to drive China and its relationships in the neighborhood, in the regions close to China, but more globally, towards a new phase of Chinese socialism in a new era, a more technologically driven, a more connected international network of trading, investment, knowledge exchange, and South-South cooperation in many respects, but also South-North-South cooperation too. So having it written into the Communist Party's constitution, along with the other key components of President Xi Jinping's thought, really is indicating the primacy of this, the flagship nature of this, and how so many of the other economic and political and socio-cultural policies and foreign relations are all linked in to this central concept and practical initiative. Its stated aim, as you may well know, is to act as a major driver for investment in land and sea-based connectivity, to bring together and connect regions, interregional relationships, to be able to focus very much on building these connections in order to facilitate, encourage, and drive the new phases of economic growth and sustainable development around the world. Its initial focus, its initial focus was very much on energy and basic infrastructure. It's now, of course, widened to include trade and manufacturing, the internet, data exchange, tourism, health, education, and a vast range of aspects of policy areas, of policy domains. So it's become institutionalized. It's part of the institutional fabric. It has its own administration. It has a series of BRI forum, most recently in virtual form, of course, in which they bring together those who are members, who are prospective members, and those who are just generally quite interested in finding out more about what's going on. The initiative has seen many Chinese companies, both state-owned enterprises and private enterprises, working with the Chinese government and governments around many regions of the world now, in just about every part of the world, in order to provide finance, know-how, practical skills, and to link in to various supply chains and value chains, and to be able to deliver an infrastructure and a working operational fabric to this particular initiative. Thank you, George. As you may well know, it really started off with the idea of a continental land-based Silk Road, and this term still is in general usage today. The idea of quite romantically trying to link it to the historic past, providing some authenticity, some legitimacy in history, but also to raise the prospect of continental, intercontinental, transcontinental connections, to restore the trade routes, the old trade routes, through to Europe. And then adding to that came the 21st century maritime Silk Road. So really driving down right the way down into Southeast Asia, or up around, now through to the Arctic and the Antarctic, added to this as well. A series of corridors run as channels through or adjacent to the Belt and Road routes, major routes. Sorry, there's a chat come through. I couldn't quite read it all, I'm afraid. Perhaps if George was able to get that, he could compile these at the end. So I'll come back to that. So really, this is setting out the parameters, the landscape of this particular initiative. Okay. George? I thought it might be useful and helpful to put forward some thoughts about how China today is framing, contextualizing its international relations, its foreign relations, and with relevance to the Belt and Road Initiative in 2021. So what are the various components or influencing contextual factors here? Well, we had China publish China and the World, which was really an official statement that was trying to explain and I think respond to international question marks about how China sees itself in the world and how it places itself or seeks to place itself in the context of the global system and regional relationships. What does China view as the world? What does it see China contributing? And what does the world contribute to China? And I think one of the things that came out of this was a strong message that was coming from the government that it wanted to be much more directly and centrally engaged in the global institutional system. That the possibilities for a sort of revolutionary approach, one that is going to seek to dramatically change, certainly in the short and medium term, the institutional fabric of the global system, basically the Bretton Woods institutions, as well as the dynamic forces of trade, its entry in the early 2000s into the World Trade Organization, I think was a symbolic gesture, but it was also a very practical message that it was not seeking, at this present time at least, to undertake a dramatic change in this existing order, and orderliness, the rules and procedures and structures. But it does intend to seek reform of the United Nations, reform of the weighting of the financial voting patterns in the IMF, for example, much further than has been undertaken very recently. It's taken a long time. And in this, it's very representative of the wider emerging economies, the BRICS countries, and of course, the wider global south, if you want to use that term. So China and the world, I think, is also about multilateralism. China has always been very strongly interested in bilateralism as a principal mechanism for its foreign relations. But as the BRI project itself demonstrates, multilateralism has come much more strongly to the fore, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. A second dimension that is influencing the context of the BRI today is the International Development Assistance and South-South Cooperation white paper that was published just last month in January 2021. Well, the first thing that perhaps is noticeable about this is the very title. In 2011 and 2014, we had the publication of white papers, as a number of you will know, that were entitled Foreign Aid, China's Foreign Aid. Now we see this very distinctive, very important symbolic change and practical signaling from China that it's now embracing this idea of international development assistance as part of its overall strategy and understanding of the dynamics of sustainable development. It's linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, to climate change agreement, and to inclusive globalization. Importantly, it's also framed here in terms of South-South cooperation. And I think this is something that we're seeing and going to see more and more important, greater and greater emphasis being placed upon South-South cooperation in China's foreign relations and approach to international development. And the BRI is very much a central component of this, and trying to draw together the different regions, the different economies of the developing countries into a sort of framework is seen as helping to focus attention, to focus finance, to focus practical assistance and project work, and to build that connectivity that I spoke of earlier. So this is really quite an important statement, I think. International development assistance, it's taking stock of what has happened over the last decade, China's internal reorganization to establish a specific administrative unit looking at international development, a series of think tanks and support infrastructure in terms of policy formulation, thinking, knowledge exchange. Rather than the more fragmented approach that you had previously with the Ministry of Commerce and the Foreign Ministry, both having a sort of co-management of the foreign aid, as it was then called. So this is more focused, and it's also a symbolic representation of China's prioritization. I think this is very much tied down to President Xi's own thought, as it's been described and put into the party constitution, and into state policy. The idea of people-centered development. This is something that's central to internal, domestic, sustainable development policy, and increasingly feeding through into practice. that this is partly driven by the party itself, the idea that the party needed to get back closer to the people, to meet many of the popular concerns that were rising, really as the costs of growth, and that the party needed to be seen to be representative, to responsive, and to engage with the citizenry to a much greater degree. But this is something that's translating too into the international domain. And I think it's a very central component that President Xi himself at Davos in 2016 publicly stated that we have to remember, he said to the CEOs, state leaders, presidents, prime ministers, and civil society representatives that were present in the audience, that development is very much about people and being able to provide for their needs in the current century. Talking of the World Economic Forum in Davos in January this year, his latest presentation in a virtual event emphasized the importance of multilateralism at the very heart of economic development, inclusive economic development in the world, bringing in developing economies very much into the heart of inclusive globalization, and to make sure that globalization truly brings in all parties, all members of the global economic and political system. And that this has to be the bedrock, and this builds trust and a durability to international relations and to foreign policy relationships, and helps to strengthen the dialogue, but also the agreed policy, the degree of consensus around the direction of global economic and developmental growth in this century. And President Xi emphasized the importance of the market in China. This would be a central component, a prioritization for China in order to deliver on its own economic sustainable development, and thereby to the international economic system as well. In that international system, a central role he pinpointed was to the G20. And G20, I think, has been a very important forum for China. It sees it ever since 2016, and perhaps before that too, as being a means outside of the old established Bretton Woods institutions for dialogue, consensus building, but also an opportunity for China to help to guide international development policy. Of course, it's expected that next month we'll see the 14th five-year plan and long-term development plan through to 2030, where the market will become a key driver, the private sector will be re-emphasized in its importance, the significance of the circulation approach, the new circulation approach to Chinese economic development, domestic consumption-driven growth, rather than the reliance on the rather unpredictable uncertainties of the global trading and investment system. So a smart, innovative, higher value economy, in part as leading Chinese officials have said, the middle class is now a very core component in helping to drive the direction of Chinese sustainable development and the expectations of that. And the Chinese government officials suggest there's around about 400 million now that it would classify in the various middle classes. These, I think, are all key components in the way that China frames its understanding of the BRI in 2021. And also in this important year, for climate change discussion and policy formulation. Green, low carbon economy linked with, of course, the implications for health, not just emergency health provision, but the health infrastructure. Again, the BRI has driven forward in terms of trying to create various forms of Silk Road that address some of these features. Corruption issues, inequality, spatial poverty. It's notable perhaps that the Chinese government announced that it had met the target of eliminating the elimination of extreme poverty in December 2020. But of course, a number of investigative reports, such as in The Economist most recently, was arguing that, in fact, when you go to villages, there's a lot of skepticism and pessimism about the actual extent to which the monitoring exercise operated and just how poverty has been eliminated. But of course, this is always regarded as being one of the success stories of modern China to reduce poverty. And this, again, is something on the agenda, key to the agenda of the BRI in 2021. But of course, there are so many issues around the global system, as you know. US-China trade relations, particularly with President Biden's administration coming in, not seen any real movement there. Away from the Trump administration's policies at this stage. Sino-Indian relations, again with the BRI, India, like the United States under Trump and Obama, has held off being directly involved, not attending the Belt and Road Fora. It's concerned about the geopolitics and geostrategic issues relating to corridors running through Pakistan and contested territories. Of course, the importance of the BRICS group and emerging economies and the role of the new institutions such as the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and how they're sponsoring green, sustainable projects on a very different basis from what had hitherto been the case in the Bretton Woods institutions. And again, linked to the SDG and trying to meet the 2030 agenda, as well as the climate change agreement targets as well. Thank you, George. All this map is doing is just trying to give an impression of the, or outline of the two main routes, the maritime and the land routes, and the extent to which they're crisscrossing the globe, and the extent to which this project has really gone global. Thank you, George. It's really for information. I think you have this as pre-reading as well. Thank you. The reason why I've put this particular slide in is because it does encompass the sort of extended nature, the Arctic policy coming in with prospects of dredging, of commercial routes being strengthened in the far north. And so you can see that it's expanding. In Africa, we've just in January, we've had Botswana and the CDC, DRC, I think, joining the BRI as well, taking the number of African states to 46 as members of the BRI. So you've seen this evolution of the BRI, and I would also link this into the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. Since it's going since the early 2000s, FOCAC has been the main framework for this relationship. But increasingly, as the BRI has strengthened and become institutionalized, my view is that the FOCAC, whilst it has its distinctive institutionalized processes, which are very robust, you also have it directly linked to the BRI as well. So they're interwoven, they're interlocking now to a very significant extent. Thank you, George. What are the sort of opportunities that are said to be associated with the BRI today? Well, policy coordination, planning, supporting large-scale infrastructure projects, connectivity of facilities, the building, the construction of these facilities along the various corridors, facilitating cross-border investments and the supply chain cooperation. And I think the cross-border nature of the African free trade community that is finally being able to be launched after COVID has always had a strong support from China, and it's always pushed for these cross-border investments and trade, trans-border trade relations. So it'd be interesting to see how this pans out in the coming year. Enhancing monetary policy coordination, bilateral financial cooperation, the services sector, financing, a thorny issue. Promoting people-to-people bonds and cooperation as well. I think one of the things that's come out of the pandemic is that many of the Chinese communities around the world were really, I think, substantively for the first time, drawn into the national needs of China to acquire personal protection equipment in the first instance, to send to China in its urgency, but then also to redistribute and to distribute PPE in their particular communities. So I think that's been quite an interesting aspect. And again, this falls under the overall ambit of the BRI as well. Thank you. Just a few sort of key thoughts to maybe stimulate some debate. Almost 8 years, the BRI, as we've seen, the BRI's scope, its ambition, its membership, its infrastructure, and the substantive project portfolio that's grown up. Way over 1,000 projects have been estimated to have been initiated. And it's really grown exponentially. As I said before, becoming this $1 trillion global development project. Now, there's lots of debate about this, whether in fact it has maintained the pace and the expectations, whether it's realized this. The last forum, BRI forum, many said was really to recharge the batteries and to give a new sense of momentum, that it was sort of a sense of slowing down as you get embedded away from the sort of flag waving and the excitement of the initial project years through into the hard reality of creating projects that are going to be viable and achieve the ends that have been set. Thank you, George. So 15 months of pandemic turmoil, global and national lockdowns, clearly had an adverse impact on Chinese economy. GDP annual growth rate plunged for a while. It's now picking up in the last quarter of 2020 and through the first signs in 2021. And also steadily, as regional economy, China's economy builds up, BRI partners, I believe, are starting to look at how their sustainable economic development can be spurred through new momentum, new initiatives through the BRI in order to help to kickstart and restore their economic growth. Back in June 2020, about halfway through the first lockdown period, first wave, if you want to use that terminology, June 2020, the Foreign Ministry indicated that the virus had seriously affected around about 20% of all BRI projects. About another 40% had been adversely affected, and around about 30 to 40% was somewhat affected at that stage. Thank you, George. However, whilst this locomotive has really slowed in its progress due to the pandemic, it certainly hasn't been derailed. Short-term and in some BRI economies, medium-term economic and business climate disruption will be accompanied by interventions, public policy, economic recovery programs. Some of these will be linked to the G20, some will be linked to China itself. The renewed business climate confidence, I think, could come through from this. And the commitments that have been made and the high-profile speeches by the senior leadership in China to say that the BRI is going to be a key driver of economic recovery in many of the regions of the world that it operates in. I think it's also seeking to be a confidence-building measure and to say, yes, we're still behind this and strongly behind this. Foreign Minister Wang Yi said in December that the BRI had continued its work with extensive number of online meetings and practical contact. High levels of investment was argued to have continued, and the fight against COVID had been facilitated through the BRI cooperation process in terms of health and in terms of emergency cooperation. So having that framework there was very, very important. Thank you, George. I'm conscious of the time here. Now, a caveat. The optimistic picture here doesn't mean that the BRI doesn't now and will not in the future face significant pre-COVID-19 questions and challenges, as well as those generated by the pandemic itself. If we have a look at some of these issues now, and I just will run through the list, and I'm sure that some people will want to pick up and ask questions on this. George, if we're able to change it. So financing, there's always been a question about just whether there was sufficient investment money available, either from China itself or through private and state and policy banks in China, or the wider global financial community. Whether enough money, whether too many reservations, people holding off before they seek to really make their investments. Is there enough money there to keep it going? Sovereign indebtedness has been a very sensitive, very controversial area, that many of the projects are based on various types of loans and some grants, but mainly loans. So sovereign indebtedness has, according to a number of critics, grown substantially and become a serious problem, potential problem for the BRI. The actual governance and running of the BRI in its many different aspects, economic, environmental, for example, has been raised with regards to so-called safeguarding of issues. To what extent does the BRI conform to international norms and principles and regulations and expectations of right conduct that have been negotiated and set in place for a long time? Often very difficult process. So the question of safeguarding, I think, has impacted on the degree to which a number of countries have held off and joining the BRI, such as the UK. Issues, specific issues on contracts, awarding of contracts, the transparency, investment, project risk management, labour practices, taxation, repatriation of earnings. Issues of human rights, very high on the agenda at the moment regarding China. Wider climate change mitigation criticisms, you know, how far are these projects actually contributing to adverse climate change rather than being part of the solution. Doubts surrounding the contribution to the overall global and regional, national, and even local community sustainable development, or the use of Chinese contractors, Chinese workers. Does this mean that really there's not much of a magnifier effect through into the local economy? Okay, thank you. I think we'll move on. What's the priorities in 2021? There's various Silk Roads. As you would expect, unsurprisingly, the Health Silk Road is now high on the agenda. And this was something pre-pandemic. Health infrastructure investment, knowledge sharing, personnel collaborations, training processes were all subject to the BRI action plan. COVID-19 has clearly increased the focus on this. Commercial Risk Road, the drive here is very much on e-commerce, digital transport corridors, cross-border fiber optic cables for information transmission. So moving into that sort of smart commerce. This is also, of course, interwoven with both the Green Silk Road, the idea is particularly important here for climate change discussion and debate. Additional weight placed on environmental connectivity, protection, maritime environmental protection, the building of ports. How far does this increase the danger to the environment? Do the provisions, are they strong enough? Various multilateral platforms here, the Coalition for Green Development, Green Investment Principles, and the Green Investment Fund are being placed at the heart of the current agenda. It's perhaps, though, the second aspect here of the commerce, a digital Silk Road, a priority area now for the BRI in 2021. Thank you, George. I think I've got a couple of minutes, hopefully, to get to just mention these things. China's commitments to its own domestic greening of its economy and society, and to meet climate change objectives, and to achieve low carbon emissions have been reiterated very recently in December and January by Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And the targets there are said to really be both an example, but also a driver for the BRI partners as well, that this isn't something that is just separate, but it's interwoven. And the idea of the Green Silk Road is very much at the fore. I think we're going to see a lot talk about this in 2021. I think we need to go forward a moment. Yeah. So the Digital Silk Road launched in 2015, really towards building the infrastructure of communications, telecommunications networks, AI capabilities, cloud computing, e-commerce, mobile payment systems, surveillance technology, smart cities, other high-tech areas involved in this as well. So it's really quite extensive. Some have suggested there's already been around about 138 or so DSR agreements, memoranda of understanding, and other agreements to cooperate on this aspect. Training centers, joint research institutes, development programs, knowledge sharing in some areas anyway, to help to build technical knowledge capacity. But there are significant concerns that have been raised too about data security, and a number of concerns raised about Silk Road surveillance, data sharing legislation in China for Chinese corporations, and also the very nature of surveillance itself, with the utilization of Chinese cameras, facial recognition, and a number of other technical sources in many of the countries associated with the BRI. So this is a very sensitive area. Thank you, George. Just a note too on reports that have suggested that there can be clear benefits for the BRI for the UK. Infrastructure industries, quite clearly, a very strong history and background, skills base, investment infrastructure, financial support, the services sector, the BRI very much in need of that additional element. Manufacturing, transport, agricultural technology, energy and resources, interesting cooperation between China and Scottish institutes on wave, clean energy development, e-commerce, logistics I've referred to as well. We're very well embedded in research and design and new industrial development. Healthcare, of course, and life sciences, another very strong, very evident element of comparative advantage for the UK to be involved in this. So overall, to give a lasting thing, it's going to be still a challenging year with COVID-19, the vaccine rollout, vaccine nationalism issues, the role of World Health Organization in China, its commitments to public goods and vaccine sharing. So its own vaccine is now being distributed very extensively, including through the BRI countries, but up into Europe and all across different parts of the developing world. How China's economy evolves is also going to be key. That in part also depends on the global economy. So business climate is going to have to take account of all of this. So apologies for running on a bit. So I hope we can cope with the avalanche of questions that may come.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that talk. I think we've got a couple of questions. I'm going to start with Margaret's question from earlier. Thank you, Margaret. It's saying in the chat to say, could you give details of trade of One Belt, One Road regarding the Chinese government documents? And Margaret's put up a new chat just now. The Chinese are offering loans with very few conditions as compared to the traditional international lenders. I think, can you see these questions in the chat?
Where are we? Q&A. Let's see.
Margaret has put some in the chat that might be better to look at first, and then I know there are a couple in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Right. Sorry. So much for my digital connectivity. I'll come back to this in a minute with the Q&A. Right. Okay. Thank you. Trade of One Belt, One Road regarding the Chinese government documents. Well, there's clearly, I'm not going to give you the specific ones, but at this stage, but I can always email you the links for that. The Ministry of Commerce and the Foreign Ministry publish regular reports on the BRI trade relationships and the level of trade that's undertaken for different, and breaks it down into different regions. So it's very specific. It's within. It's not the sort of general aggregated statistics alone. So I think also under specific areas such as the BRI in Africa, FOCAC documents is a good place to go to in order to find out about specifics of trade, trade relationships. Sorry. If I have your email, Margaret, I think I have your email, don't I? I think I've got it quite a lot. So I can send you some links if that's going to help. Okay, Margaret?
So I think if we'll go to the question answer next, if that's right with you, because I think Fred has put some questions earlier on while we were discussing, I think so looking at the time. So if you can see that, hi Neil, the People's Bank of China has just joined a trial out of central bank digital currency with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, Thailand and the UAE. The aim of the trial is to improve cross-border payments for goods and services. What's your opinion about China using a digital RMB in the BRI to push the RMB to become major reserve currency? Yep,
great question. I think this is going to be very strong. I think this is going to become more and more the central dynamic. I think that this part of the digital Silk Road and the priority, this is something that President Xi Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and a whole host of other senior officials have all been coming out saying that this is exactly what we're going to do. Now, clearly, Hong Kong is an interesting position at the moment, very sensitive. So for some people, they see this as just another form of limiting Hong Kong autonomy, and that, in fact, it's going to constrain the ability of Hong Kong to operate as successfully, effectively as it did before. Whereas others see this as just a steady progression. And to be honest, I think that irrespective of which school of thought you adhere to, that it's going to happen. It is happening. It's going to be strengthened. It's going to be prioritized. It'll be driven even harder because of the political situation, the social situation at the moment in Hong Kong, and whether in fact it's going to help it become a major reserve currency, I think also depends not only on depends on what happens in China, but it also happens very much on the Biden administration's approach, how that is going to play out. So this, and the European Union, Japan, this can't be done in isolation, and whether in fact the challenge that is said to be emerging on a major reserve currency becomes a juggernaut remains to be seen. But I think that it's another incremental process of building up this capacity, another component that will eventually see, maybe by 2035, this designated year of long-term development at home and internationally. I think this may well happen, but it depends on other actors too. Shall I move to the next one from Fred?
I think the next, if it's well, I'd like to put Margaret and Simon's question together. So Margaret is asking whether I think both of them about the motivations or other things that the BRI might be able to look into. So Margaret is looking at the debt issues and the potential of paying back. So is China using this project indirectly to pull other countries in their control or influence of China? And I think that's similar in a way to these sort of motivations. So Simon Huston's looking at what's the extent of BRI about resource security for China rather than trade and development. So I think with the limited time, I'd like to see if there's something to put together about the motivations of Belt.
Okay. The first thing I would say then is that China does say it's a developing country for various reasons. Political status, as I said, South-South cooperation is linked, framing the white paper in January, that it claims that the central and particularly the western provinces of China, the neighborhood and the more extended developing economies need infrastructure, they need money, they need projects, and this links to conditionality, that the established order, as Margaret has said, places significant economic, financial, political, administrative requirements upon a country upon receipt of loans. China says it has just reiterated again during Wang Yi's recent visit to Africa, his swing through Africa, that in Botswana, he was saying, we are not an interventionist power. We will not intervene in the domestic sovereign affairs of another state. That's part of our different approach to development because of our own historic experience, because of your experiences with colonialism. We believe, going right the way back to Bandung in the mid-1950s and the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that China has had in its foreign policy, that the BRI, FOCAC, China's bilateral relations, will not place undue conditionality. Now, there are some conditions to come through, particularly where there's perceptions of fraud, corruption, issues of failure of repatriation of earnings to China by various countries. But overall, this non-intervention policy, I think, is still highly controversial. Human rights, for example, is often focused upon this particular issue. I mentioned the idea of consistency, conformity to international norms in various parts of governance. And I think, of course, China is not a full member of the OECD DAC. It's now a key partner, just became a key partner designated. It's joined the Research Development Forum of OECD. It's indicated through this that it's more willing to engage, I believe, in this multilateralism. It's to be seen to be more engaged. 20 years of involvement with OECD DAC, if you take that as the sort of orthodoxy of the international community. And I think here, that's part of the questions, but all of those issues of contracts, of labor law, of transparency in the way that finances are used, projects are allocated, I think is also a very key issue. The environmental protection requirements are still highly controversial, highly questioned. As I mentioned earlier, about whether, in fact, many of these projects, the production of concrete, for example, the environmental damage that can be done through the construction industry, are the protections supposedly under the maritime Silk Route, are they there sufficiently? Are they embedded? Are they monitored? Are they enforced sufficiently well? These are major questions that remain and should and will become highly salient as we move through to Glasgow later this year, whether that's in person, but more likely online, and COP26. I think we'll see a great deal of debate hotting up in the coming months as we push forward to Glasgow.
Well, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to call the time there. It is now 3 o'clock. So I'd like to start by saying thank you very, very much for your time today, Neil. It's very kind of you to share your knowledge and experience with everyone. And thank you as well to everyone who's joined us and asked the questions. I hope everyone has received what you'd like from it. So thank you very much, one and all. And we hopefully will do something else again in the future.
Thank you very much, George, for your chairing. That's very, very well done. And thank you, everybody, for joining. And it's been an absolute pleasure to join with you today.
Excellent. Oh, well,
thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.